Corporate investigators arrived at headquarters 43 days after I resigned. They secured the executive floor before sunrise. Legal teams entered first, then compliance, then two outside investigators carrying sealed archive cases directly into the conference wing. Nobody spoke loudly that morning, not even senior leadership, because once outside investigators bypass reception protocols entirely, everyone understands something dangerous already happened. I was drinking coffee in my apartment outside Arlington when my former security administrator called me privately. His voice sounded strained. He asked only one question. Did you know this was coming? I looked across the kitchen counter before answering. Yes, just not this fast. For 8 years, I managed controlled document systems tied to executive access, strategic partnerships, and restricted technology coordination. Officially, I was a senior compliance systems manager. Unofficially, I was the person quietly preventing executive carelessness from becoming institutional disaster. Most companies have someone like that. Usually nobody notices until the protection disappears. My former boss understood power extremely well. That was what made him dangerous. He knew how to build trust upward while isolating scrutiny downward. Senior executives loved him. Investors respected him. The parent company considered him untouchable. Meanwhile, people inside operational compliance learned to stop asking difficult questions around him. Not because he shouted, because he redirected pressure professionally. That is how sophisticated corporate manipulation actually works. Quietly, through influence fatigue. I spent years believing loyalty and discipline would eventually correct the imbalance naturally. Instead, the imbalance grew stronger. The first real fracture appeared 6 months before I resigned. One of our restricted technology transfer files moved through an executive approval path without proper chain of custody verification. Small issue on paper. Massive issue inside compliance systems. At first I assumed procedural oversight. Then I noticed something worse. The missing authorization sequence connected directly to materials my boss personally requested remain compartmentalized. That changed how I looked at everything afterward. I started reviewing access histories more carefully. Behavioral patterns emerged quickly once I stopped assuming innocence automatically. Unusual retrieval timing. Temporary archive removals. Executive exceptions bypassing standard review pathways. Nothing dramatic individually. That was the terrifying part. Real institutional corruption rarely announces itself clearly. It survives through accumulated procedural compromises everyone learns not to challenge anymore. I became more careful after that. More observant. I started embedding traceable formatting markers inside sensitive document structures. Nothing illegal, nothing destructive, just silent verification architecture. A way to track movement patterns if records appeared somewhere they should never exist. At the same time, I quietly rebuilt myself outside the company. Certifications, federal compliance coursework, external legal seminars, risk governance training, brick by brick. Because deep down I already understood something painful. The safest person inside a compromised organization is usually the one preparing emotionally to leave it. My boss noticed the changes eventually. I stopped volunteering for after-hours archive corrections. Stopped shielding executive irregularities automatically. Stopped solving invisible problems before leadership noticed them. That frustrated him immediately. Because executives grow addicted to silent protection very quickly, especially when they mistake professionalism for permanent obedience. 3 weeks before I resigned, a competitor referenced restricted terminology during a private industry conference call. Terminology that existed only inside protected internal strategy files. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself completely. And 43 days later, corporate investigators arrived at headquarters asking for one thing first. The archived document movement logs only I maintained correctly. The investigators contacted me officially 2 days later. Not through human resources. Not through corporate counsel. Directly through the parent company's external compliance division. That detail mattered immediately. Because once a parent company bypasses internal leadership structures, trust inside the organization is already damaged. The investigator leading the review introduced herself calmly. Former federal procurement oversight. Now specializing in corporate governance exposure. Her questions were precise. Not emotional. She did not ask whether I believed my former boss was corrupt. She asked whether executive document behavior changed over time in ways inconsistent with established compliance controls. That was the first moment I realized the investigation was much larger than I originally assumed. I agreed to cooperate carefully, only with preserved documentation, only through formal review procedures, and only after securing legal protection personally. People underestimate how dangerous institutional loyalty becomes once executives start protecting themselves. I learned that lesson slowly, painfully. 8 years earlier, my boss recruited me directly into strategic compliance operations after a controlled access systems breach embarrassed the company publicly. At the time, he looked different to me. Disciplined, confident, protective of institutional integrity. He spoke constantly about accountability and operational trust. I believed him completely. Most high-functioning corporate manipulation begins with partial truth. That is why intelligent people fall for it. Over time, I became responsible for increasingly sensitive systems, technology licensing archives, restricted strategy transfers, executive authorization chains, internal document preservation logic. I built redundancies nobody noticed, verification pathways, movement controls, access recovery structures, invisible systems, the kind organizations depend on quietly while pretending they operate automatically. My boss praised me often privately, rarely publicly. Another pattern I only understood years later. Invisible people are easier to control when leadership benefits from their silence professionally. 3 years into the role, executive exceptions started increasing. Temporary overrides, expedited authorizations, compartmentalized removals, always justified as strategic urgency. At first I accepted it. Large companies create procedural pressure constantly. But eventually the exceptions stopped behaving like emergencies. They started behaving like habits. That distinction changed everything. One evening after an executive partner dinner in Georgetown, I returned to finalize restricted archive reconciliation before the quarterly compliance lock. A protected technology transfer file showed retrieval activity under executive authorization. Nothing unusual there, except the physical archive seal timing no longer matched the digital access chain. Impossible under standard controls. I stayed in the office until nearly 2 in the morning reconstructing movement history manually. That was when I discovered something deeply unsettling. The access irregularities consistently appeared near projects involving external strategic negotiations my boss personally supervised. Not random, patterned. I wanted to believe coincidence desperately, because once trust collapses inside executive compliance structures, every earlier interaction starts changing meaning retroactively. The next morning my boss entered my office carrying coffee casually, completely relaxed. He asked whether archive reconciliation finished cleanly overnight. Very specific wording. Not, did everything look fine? He asked whether reconciliation finished cleanly. People reveal themselves through procedural language eventually, especially when pressure rises. I answered carefully, still reviewing several movement inconsistencies. He paused only briefly, then smiled and told me not to become overly rigid around executive workflows. That sentence stayed with me for years afterward. Because inside healthy organizations, compliance exists to protect leadership from risk. Inside compromised organizations, leadership starts treating compliance as the risk itself. 3 weeks later, I discovered restricted files appearing in temporary executive transfer channels without permanent archival trace history. That should never happen accidentally. And for the first time in 8 years, I quietly began preserving evidence against my own boss. Once I started preserving evidence quietly, my entire relationship with the company changed. Not publicly, behaviorally. I became more aware of silence, more aware of timing, more aware of who entered rooms after meetings ended instead of before they started. Corporate corruption rarely looks dramatic from inside. Usually it feels procedural. That is why intelligent people tolerate it longer than they should. I stopped trusting memory after that. Everything became documentation. Access timestamps, transfer routing, authorization overlap, executive retrieval patterns. I built verification structures slowly and carefully. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just traceable behavioral architecture embedded inside systems I already managed legitimately. Most organizations underestimate how vulnerable executive workflows become once somebody patient starts observing patterns instead of personalities. At first, my boss seemed unconcerned. He still joked casually during executive dinners, still praised operational loyalty publicly, still treated me like a trusted internal protector. But subtle pressure started appearing everywhere around me. Unexpected review requests, leadership exclusions, additional approval layers around projects I previously handled directly. Classic institutional isolation behavior. Not enough to justify complaint. Enough to create uncertainty. That strategy works extremely well inside large corporations, especially against disciplined employees, because procedural professionals usually blame themselves first. I nearly did too. Then Chicago happened. Every year, the company hosted a restricted strategy conference involving outside legal partners, executive leadership, and selected technology vendors. Highly compartmentalized, carefully controlled attendance. During one private breakout discussion, a competitor representative referenced internal terminology connected to a restricted technology framework I personally archived 6 months earlier. Specific terminology, not industry language. Not coincidence. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds. Nobody else reacted visibly. I did, because I knew exactly where those phrases existed officially. Inside controlled files with limited executive access authorization. I remember sitting motionless through the rest of the meeting while my pulse slowed instead of accelerated. That was the moment emotional doubt disappeared completely. Calm replaces confusion once suspicion becomes measurable. After Chicago, I changed strategy entirely. I stopped correcting invisible executive problems automatically. That was difficult emotionally. For years, I protected the company instinctively. Now I needed to protect institutional truth instead. Those are not always the same thing. I reduced my office presence carefully, worked remotely more often, declined unnecessary executive travel, allowed smaller procedural irregularities to surface naturally instead of repairing them silently beforehand. The effect appeared faster than I expected. Archive reconciliation delays increased. Authorization conflicts started reaching secondary compliance review. Temporary transfer inconsistencies began generating internal escalation notices automatically. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Enough friction for systems to reveal where invisible stabilization had existed previously. My boss became noticeably more impatient after that. Not frightened yet, just irritated. Executives grow dependent on hidden competence very quickly when it protects their operational comfort. One Friday evening near the end of the quarter, I stayed late reviewing restricted movement reconciliation after most departments left. A temporary executive transfer chain connected to one of my embedded trace markers suddenly disappeared from the system history entirely for 17 minutes. Impossible under normal retention controls. I reconstructed the chain manually from backup synchronization records. The destination pathway terminated inside an external executive review environment that should never have received the material. I stared at the reconstructed routing map for a long time afterward, because for the first time, I was no longer looking at procedural irregularity. I was looking at intentional removal behavior, and someone inside executive leadership already knew the systems were starting to notice. After the 17-minute archive disappearance, I stopped thinking about misconduct emotionally. Now I thought about containment. That changes a person quietly. Fear becomes procedural once danger turns measurable. I spent the next several weeks redesigning how I moved through the company. Less visibility. Fewer unnecessary conversations, more documented handoffs, more formal escalation pathways. I also stopped protecting executive workflow inconsistencies automatically. That decision changed the entire organization faster than I expected. Small operational disturbances started surfacing naturally. Access reconciliation delays, authorization mismatch alerts, unresolved transfer queues, secondary compliance reviews triggering unexpectedly. Nothing catastrophic. That was what made it dangerous. Healthy systems absorb minor instability continuously. Compromised systems depend on invisible people suppressing instability before leadership notices it. I had spent years doing exactly that. Now the organization was slowly experiencing its own unmanaged behavior for the first time. My boss noticed immediately. One afternoon, he asked me to join him for coffee outside the office near DuPont Circle. Very casual setting, which usually means executives want emotional compliance instead of documented accountability. He talked about loyalty first, then pressure, then organizational trust. Classic sequencing. Eventually, he leaned back and asked why compliance friction suddenly seemed to increase around executive document pathways. Interesting wording again. Not, why are systems failing? Why does friction seem to increase? He already understood the systems were detecting something. He just wanted the discomfort reduced again. I answered carefully. I told him I stopped manually correcting procedural inconsistencies before formal review cycles. That was technically true. He became very quiet after that. Not angry. Evaluating. Predatory executives rarely escalate emotionally first. They measure resistance. The conversation ended professionally, but the atmosphere around me shifted permanently afterward. More exclusion, more indirect scrutiny, more leadership distance. I think he finally realized something important. I was no longer functioning as silent protection. Around the same time, I started preserving additional evidence outside company infrastructure entirely. Encrypted archival copies, independent legal timestamping, external compliance retention. Not because I planned revenge, because institutional power changes rapidly once exposure risk appears. People who ignored problems for years suddenly start protecting themselves aggressively. I understood that now. The deeper issue became clearer too. The company's security systems were never truly designed to monitor executive misconduct effectively. Only employee misconduct. That realization became the midpoint of everything. Leadership believed authority itself reduced risk. Reality was the opposite. The higher the authority level, the fewer meaningful safeguards actually existed. And my boss understood that weakness perfectly. One Friday evening near quarter close, a junior compliance analyst approached me privately in the parking structure below headquarters. Nervous, avoiding eye contact, he asked whether archive synchronization failures around executive transfer chains were normal. I asked what he saw first. He explained that several restricted transfer histories appeared temporarily incomplete during overnight reconciliation before restoring later automatically. Exactly the pattern I already recognized. Except now other people were noticing it too. That was extremely dangerous. Because once irregularities become visible to lower-level analysts, containment windows start shrinking rapidly. I told him to preserve every reconciliation discrepancy formally and avoid discussing the issue internally without documentation. He nodded immediately. Scared professionals recognize procedural danger instinctively. That night, I reviewed the latest archive recovery logs remotely from home. One restricted transfer chain connected to my embedded verification markers terminated briefly inside an external acquisition review server associated with one of our largest competitors. And this time the transfer trail did not disappear accidentally. Someone tried to overwrite the recovery history manually afterward. The attempted overwrite changed the situation permanently, because accidental irregularities do not erase recovery histories manually. People do. I remember sitting alone in my apartment outside Arlington after midnight, staring at the reconstructed transfer chain while rain hit the windows softly. Not angry, mostly exhausted. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that appears when loyalty finally collapses completely inside your mind. You stop trying to rescue the illusion. That was the real turning point. Not the override itself. The acceptance. I began preparing my exit immediately after that. Quietly. Professionally. I updated every certification record tied to my compliance work. Expanded my external legal network. Archived preservation records through Independent Retention Counsel. Reviewed whistleblower protection procedures without triggering company notification systems. Brick by brick again. People imagine institutional exposure happens dramatically. Usually it begins with someone quietly preparing to survive the truth. Meanwhile, my boss became more performative internally, more visible around executive leadership, more aggressive about organizational loyalty messaging. That pattern did not surprise me anymore. Executives under invisible pressure often increase symbolic authority displays before operational control weakens publicly. The organization itself also started changing subtly. Secondary compliance reviews increased. Temporary archive inconsistencies triggered more reconciliation cycles. Several lower-level analysts quietly started escalating document movement anomalies through formal pathways instead of resolving them informally. That mattered enormously. Because invisible systems become unstable once enough people stop suppressing friction voluntarily. One afternoon, a parent company governance representative requested a private operational review call with me unexpectedly. No executives present. No internal leadership oversight. Just governance. That detail alone told me the parent company already suspected something serious. The representative asked calm procedural questions for nearly an hour. Archive integrity, executive override frequency, authorization chain consistency, behavioral irregularities. Then he asked something much more dangerous. Why did executive reconciliation anomalies increase after I reduced direct operational involvement? I stayed quiet briefly before answering. Because I stopped manually stabilizing inconsistencies before formal review pathways detected them. Silence followed immediately afterward. Recognition silence, not confusion. That was the moment I realized parent company governance already understood the company depended heavily on undocumented invisible corrections. The representative thanked me carefully before ending the call. 3 days later, internal legal suddenly announced a broad executive document retention audit tied to strategic compliance modernization. Corporate language always softens danger first. Nobody believed the explanation completely, especially not inside compliance operations. My boss called me into his office that same afternoon. The atmosphere felt different immediately. No casual charm anymore. No mentorship performance. Just controlled pressure. He asked whether I discussed executive archive inconsistencies externally. Very precise wording again. Not, did you report concerns? He asked whether I discussed inconsistencies externally. That told me he already feared containment failure. I answered truthfully. I discussed operational reconciliation concerns through authorized governance review pathways. His jaw tightened slightly after that. Small physical reaction, but important. Because for the first time in 8 years, I saw genuine uncertainty behind his executive composure. He leaned back quietly afterward and told me something I still remember clearly. Loyal people protect leadership during difficult periods. That sentence explained everything wrong with the organization. He believed loyalty meant protecting executives from accountability. I believed loyalty meant protecting institutions from executive misconduct. Those are incompatible systems eventually. The next morning, my building access permissions triggered delayed synchronization during routine entry for the first time in 8 years. And by the end of that week, I quietly submitted my resignation. My resignation meeting lasted 11 minutes. Human resources attended remotely. My boss stayed unusually calm. That was the first thing I noticed. Executives become calmer once they believe exposure risk has already been contained. He asked whether another company recruited me. I told him no. At least not yet. That answer seemed to relax him slightly. He probably assumed exhaustion pushed me out, not evidence preservation. The official exit paperwork described my departure as voluntary strategic career transition. Clean language. Minimal disruption. Large corporations prefer neutral wording during unstable periods. It protects leadership psychologically. What they did not understand was this. My departure was not the dangerous event. The dangerous event was the removal of invisible stabilization from systems leadership barely understood existed. I spent my final 2 weeks transitioning archive responsibilities carefully. Documented handoffs. Formal transfer acknowledgments. Chain of custody preservation. Independent retention verification. I became almost obsessively procedural. Not from paranoia. From experience. Organizations under hidden stress begin rewriting memory extremely quickly once accountability appears possible. I trusted documentation now more than relationships. Several lower-level analysts behaved differently around me during those final days. More cautious. More respectful. Some already sensed deeper instability. People inside operational systems usually notice institutional fear before executives do. One analyst quietly asked whether compliance modernization was really the reason outside governance teams suddenly requested archived reconciliation history. I answered carefully. Organizations do not increase preservation reviews unless they are preparing for future scrutiny. He stared at me silently after that. Because professionals inside governance understand exactly what future scrutiny means. My final morning inside headquarters felt strangely normal. That disturbed me more than anything else. People still joked in elevators. Still discussed quarterly forecasts. Still argued about budget projections. Meanwhile, external governance teams were already reconstructing years of executive document behavior quietly beneath the surface. Institutional collapse rarely announces itself emotionally at first. Most people continue following routine until systems force recognition suddenly. I left my building access badge on the security desk shortly before noon. No dramatic exit. No speeches. Just procedural closure. As I walked toward the parking structure, my phone vibrated with an incoming message from an external legal consultant I trusted privately. The message contained only one sentence. Parent company initiated restricted preservation directive this morning. I stopped walking immediately. Because preservation directives happen before formal investigations become visible publicly, that meant leadership above my boss already feared evidence destruction risk. The timeline accelerated quickly after that. 9 days later, several executive archive permissions were temporarily suspended for overnight reconciliation review. 2 weeks later, outside legal teams arrived on site quietly after business hours. 3 weeks later, internal audit began requesting historical authorization recovery logs tied to executive transfer chains. Not summaries. Original recovery logs. The exact records I preserved most carefully. Meanwhile, my former boss continued operating publicly like nothing serious was happening. Town halls, leadership briefings, investor meetings. Confident, polished, still protected by executive authority structures. But operationally, pressure was building everywhere underneath him now. Archive retrieval delays increased. Legal review requests multiplied. Governance escalations stopped resolving quietly. The invisible corrections were gone, and systems started behaving honestly again. Then 26 days after my resignation, a former colleague called me from headquarters late at night. Terrified. He said external investigators were reconstructing executive document movement histories manually from backup recovery environments. I asked him one question. Did they request pre-reconciliation archive states yet? Silence. Then he answered quietly. How did you know about those? Because once investigators start requesting unreconciled recovery history, they are no longer searching for procedural mistakes. They are searching for intentional behavior patterns. The official investigation became visible on day 31. Not publicly. Internally. That distinction matters inside corporations. Most institutional collapses begin invisibly long before employees recognize them emotionally. Executive calendars changed first, then legal scheduling patterns, then overnight archive access restrictions. By the second week of formal review, entire executive assistants stopped speaking casually in hallways. Fear spreads behaviorally before it spreads verbally. A former colleague from governance called me from a secure line late one evening. His voice sounded controlled but exhausted. He told me investigators were reconstructing executive document behavior manually from raw recovery environments dating back almost 4 years. That was extremely significant, because reconstructed recovery environments bypass curated archive narratives entirely. They reveal behavioral truth, not executive summaries. I asked whether investigators isolated the temporary authorization chains yet. Long silence. Then he answered carefully. They found embedded preservation markers inside archive transfer structures. That was the moment I finally understood the investigation had moved beyond internal concern. My markers were never designed dramatically. Simple formatting asymmetries, invisible timestamp sequencing, traceable retention signatures, quiet verification architecture. The purpose was never entrapment, only confirmation. Because once institutional trust collapses, certainty becomes survival. According to my colleague, investigators initially believed the markers were accidental system artifacts. Then patterns emerged. The markers consistently appeared near executive transfer chains connected to restricted external negotiations. And more importantly, they survived attempted recovery modifications. That detail terrified legal teams immediately. Because preservation-resistant trace structures implies somebody anticipated future reconstruction efforts long before the investigation officially began. My former boss still maintained executive authority publicly during all this. That was the unbelievable part. Town halls continued. Quarterly messaging continued. Leadership presentations continued. But internally, governance behavior changed dramatically around him. Executives stopped forwarding sensitive approvals casually. Legal requested secondary review constantly. Compliance teams started documenting verbal instructions formally instead of informally resolving them. Institutional trust was evaporating in real time. One afternoon, my former colleague forwarded me something unofficially through encrypted counsel channels. A reconstruction summary from investigators. Most sections remained heavily restricted, but one paragraph mattered enormously. Investigators concluded that executive archive irregularities demonstrated sustained behavioral intent inconsistent with accidental procedural deviation. Cold language. Devastating meaning. Because corporations can survive mistakes, intentional behavioral patterns trigger something much worse. Liability exposure. That same evening, I received a formal request from parent company legal counsel asking whether I would participate voluntarily in protected investigative interviews. Not testimony yet. Protected cooperation. I agreed immediately under legal representation. The interview took place inside a private governance office near Bethesda 3 days later. No intimidation. No dramatic accusations. Just extremely disciplined procedural questioning. They already knew most of the timeline. That became obvious quickly. What they needed from me was behavioral context. How executive pressure evolved. How compliance friction changed. When invisible stabilization stopped. Why irregularities surfaced more aggressively after my reduced involvement. That last question stayed with me afterward. Because the answer exposed the organization completely. The irregularities did not suddenly increase. The suppression stopped. I explained that carefully during the interview. For years, operational staff corrected inconsistencies before leadership experienced consequences directly. Once enough people stopped doing that invisibly, the system began behaving honestly again. One investigator stopped writing temporarily after I said that, then asked something much more dangerous. Did your former boss understand you were preserving evidence before you resigned? I thought about the coffee meeting near DuPont Circle. The pressure, the wording, the behavioral shifts afterward. Then I answered truthfully. I think he understood the protection was disappearing. I do not think he realized how much institutional memory survived after I left. The lead investigator closed the folder slowly after that. Then she told me something I never forgot. Organizations usually fail long before investigations begin. Investigations only reveal where the failure was already hiding. The formal interview request arrived on day 41, 2 days before investigators secured headquarters officially. By then, the organization already understood something irreversible was happening. Not publicly, structurally. Executive assistants started documenting verbal instructions immediately after meetings. Legal review delays expanded across multiple departments. Governance teams stopped allowing expedited executive exceptions without secondary preservation logging. The company was no longer operating on trust. It was operating on traceability. That transition changes institutional psychology very quickly. I returned to headquarters under protected access authorization through a private underground entrance normally reserved for outside counsel and board advisors. Interesting detail. Because once organizations start routing former employees through legal infrastructure instead of human resources infrastructure, the emotional phase is already over. Now everything becomes liability management. The interview took place inside a secured governance conference room on the 14th floor. No executive branding. No department identifiers. Just legal binders. Recovery diagrams. Authorization timelines. 3 investigators attended, along with 1 representative from the parent company's board oversight division. That detail mattered most, because boards usually appear late, only after leadership credibility weakens materially. The lead investigator walked me through reconstructed archive behavior spanning nearly 6 years. The level of reconstruction shocked even me. Transfer chains, override timing, authorization sequencing, recovery state discrepancies, temporary archive suppression windows. They already understood almost the entire operational pattern. What they needed now was executive intent clarification. At one point, the board representative asked whether I believe the organization could have detected the behavior earlier. I answered honestly, yes, but only if leadership wanted executive compliance reviewed with the same rigor applied to lower-level employees. Silence followed immediately, not defensive silence, recognition silence, because everybody in that room already understood the deeper issue now. The systems were never designed to monitor powerful people properly, only obedient people. That was the real institutional failure. Then the investigators showed me something I had not expected. Several months before my resignation, internal governance advisors already flagged unusual executive archive behavior privately during a limited oversight review. Leadership minimized the concern. That became the final turn inside my mind. Because suddenly the entire timeline changed meaning. My preserved records did not create the investigation. They confirmed fears the parent company already struggled to ignore quietly. The organization sensed instability long before formal exposure arrived. Nobody acted decisively enough. The board representative asked one final question after that. Why did you wait before leaving? I thought about that carefully. Because the truthful answer was uncomfortable. I stayed because loyalty feels morally correct long after systems become dangerous. And because invisible professionals often believe they can stabilize institutional dysfunction quietly if they work hard enough. Most eventually learn otherwise. The interview ended shortly before sunset. As I prepared to leave, the lead investigator closed the final recovery binder slowly and told me investigators would secure headquarters formally within 48 hours. Not because they needed more evidence, because they needed to preserve what still remained intact. That sentence stayed with me during the entire drive home. 43 days after my resignation, investigators entered headquarters before sunrise. Executive offices were secured, recovery environments isolated, archive permissions frozen, and for the first time in years, nobody inside leadership could quietly rewrite the institutional memory anymore. Later that afternoon, the parent company contacted me privately again, not as a witness this time, as a candidate. They wanted to discuss rebuilding corporate compliance oversight after the investigation concluded. And somewhere inside headquarters, my former boss was finally realizing the invisible systems protecting him had disappeared long before investigators arrived. The company never released full details publicly. Most corporations do not. They prefer controlled language, governance restructuring, executive transition statements. Institutional damage sounds cleaner once legal teams rewrite it professionally. My former boss disappeared from leadership communications within 3 weeks after investigators secured headquarters. No farewell announcement. No executive celebration. Just silence. Inside large organizations, silence usually means negotiations are happening somewhere behind closed doors. The parent company initiated broad compliance restructuring almost immediately afterward. Executive authorization pathways changed. Archive reconciliation authority expanded. Secondary governance oversight became mandatory for restricted transfers. Invisible controls finally became formal controls. Interesting how organizations suddenly value safeguards once instability becomes expensive enough. I stayed outside the company during most of the restructuring period. That distance mattered emotionally. For years I believed proximity to leadership created influence. Now I understood something very different. Distance creates clarity, especially after institutional betrayal. Several former colleagues contacted me privately over the following months. Some sounded angry, others embarrassed. A few admitted they noticed irregular behavior years earlier, but assumed executive authority meant somebody else already approved the risk properly. That sentence haunted me for a long time afterward, because it explains how intelligent organizations slowly normalize dangerous behavior without realizing it. Responsibility becomes abstract, then invisible, then optional. One former analyst told me the atmosphere inside headquarters changed permanently after the investigation. People documented verbal instructions now. Governance teams challenged executive exceptions openly. Junior compliance staff escalated concerns faster without fear of political retaliation. The organization became less comfortable, but also more honest. That trade matters. The parent company formally approached me 6 months later about leading the rebuilt compliance oversight division. I accepted carefully, not because returning felt emotionally satisfying. Honestly, it did not. I accepted because I understood something much more important now. Healthy institutions cannot depend on invisible protection indefinitely. If accountability only survives through quiet personal sacrifice, the system is already unstable. The first morning I returned to headquarters felt strangely unfamiliar. New access controls, new legal review structures, new governance reporting lines. But the building itself still carried the same atmosphere underneath. Ambitious people, political pressure, institutional ego. Human behavior never changes as much as organizations pretend. One of the new analysts asked me privately during my second week back whether I hated my former boss after everything that happened. I thought about the question longer than he probably expected, then answered honestly, no, because hatred keeps you emotionally attached to people who already damaged the institution enough. What I felt instead was disappointment. Not just in him. In how easily organizations reward visible confidence while overlooking the quiet people protecting operational truth underneath. That was the real lesson. My former boss believed authority could control institutional memory. He misunderstood something fundamental. Systems remember more than people realize. Archive behavior, transfer timing, operational inconsistencies, invisible corrections. Eventually, patterns become impossible to suppress permanently, especially once the people protecting those patterns silently stop carrying the burden alone. I still think about those 8 years sometimes. Not emotionally anymore. More analytically. I understand now that I stayed too long trying to stabilize a system that no longer wanted accountability equally applied. Many professionals do the same thing. They confuse endurance with loyalty. They confuse silence with professionalism. And they mistake invisible sacrifice for institutional strength. But stable institutions do not depend on hidden protection forever. They survive because truth remains reviewable even when powerful people become uncomfortable. That is the difference between operational trust and institutional illusion. And most organizations discover the difference far too late.